this working?
I think your mic is, I don't think it's on here. It's my computer's covering it. It's, I was just going to not use it, but maybe it's not.
I might have to.
That's not the right
That's
thing.
not the right thing.
I don't know why this isn't.
You just want one. I'll show.
Somebody came in and I told them I didn't need the microphone, so I'm
Lisa,
sorry.
how do we turn on the microphone? And then turn it off.
This one?
Yeah, this one. Oh, this looks complicated.
Audio power on. Let's see.
Then how do I turn it off?
You can just push that little button here. It says audio power.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Where does this? Okay, now that we've got the technical matters under control, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm Tom Pollard. I'm Dean of the Graduate School and a Professor of Biology. I'd like to welcome you all to our second of 3 Company of Scholars lectures for this year. They're set in different periods of time. David Evans spoke first about the future of all the continents on Earth. So he was projecting it into the future. And Gary Tomlinson, who's giving the third lecture on April 16th, will be speaking about 1 billion years of music here. Having trouble hearing?
It's not working.
Oh, let's see. Does that help? Is that better? Well,
So maybe the knob's down below.
we're gonna, oh, it's on. Lisa, is it on back there?
Yeah, we've been down it.
Okay, maybe I'll hunker over. I'm gonna start over because these guys are recording this. Okay, go, start over. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Pollard, Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I'm also a biology professor. Well, we still haven't solved all the technical problems here. This is the penalty we pay for being on the World Wide Web. Now we're going to start over for the 3rd time. Everybody ready? Hi, I'm Tom Pollard. I'm a biology professor and Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. This is the second of 3 Company of Scholars lectures that we're having here this year, which are opportunities for our leading faculty members to address a general audience on their research interests. The first lecture was by David Evans, who spoke on the future of the positions of the continents on the face of the earth. So he was looking forward in time. The third lecture will be by Gary Tomlinson from the Department of Music. He's going to be speaking about 1 million years of music here on Earth. Today's lecture is set firmly in the present day, in between these 2 extremes. Susan Hyde will be telling us about the impact of election monitoring on the democratic process. Susan grew up in Oregon and went to Linfield College in Oregon, which is near Portland. I discovered this afternoon. She graduated from Linfield in 2000 and then went to UCSD in San Diego, where she received her PhD in political science in 2006. On the basis of a fabulous thesis, she won a national award called the Juan Lintz Award from the American Political Science Association for the best thesis of the year in the United States. Actually, it was a 2-year period on democracy. In the same year, 2006, she joined our faculty here in the political science department as an assistant professor, and I came to know her in 2011 when she was reviewed for a tenure and passed with flying colors, and I was really intrigued with the fascinating work she was doing, and the fact she's here today is because of what I learned. So she's a tenured associate professor. She's has 2 books already. One was an edited volume with some colleagues on election fraud, and then has a book in 2011 from Cornell University Press on election observation, which is the topic of her talk this afternoon. So we're going to find out how election observation impacts democracy. Susan?
Great, thank you. Great.
I think you're going to have to use
You think I'll need it? I'm normally pretty loud, so I don't know if okay, I'll leave the microphone on, but my students tell me I'm plenty loud. So thank you, Dean Pollard, or Tom, as I've just been corrected, for the introduction and especially for the invitation to speak here today. It's been kind of fun to take a step back and think about not only my research, but the sort of broader area of democracy promotion that I study, and to try to describe what I think is going on for a more general audience rather than the pretty narrow audience of political scientists that I mostly spend my time talking to. So today I'm going to discuss whether the international practice of democracy promotion actually promotes democracy. It's a tricky question for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about today. I'm going to use this lecture as a chance not only to speak about what we have already learned about democracy promotion. I think there's some interference with the microphone I'm reading on my coat. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've already learned about democracy promotion, but I'm also going to speculate on some issues associated with evaluating this question of whether democracy promotion actually promotes democracy. On the surface, many people have concluded that the answer to this question of whether democracy promotion actually promotes democracy is obviously yes. There are clearly more democracies in the world today than in any other point in human history. Freedom House, one of the main organizations that judges this sort of thing, has put the percentage of the world's population living under either free institutions or partly free institutions at something close to 65%. And this increase in the number of democracies in the world is closely correlated with effort spent on attempting to promote democracy. Yet the answer to this question of whether democracy promotion promotes democracy is much more complicated, as I'm going to talk about today. Rather than argue that the answer to my question is either yes or no, I'm going to basically argue against anyone who takes a black and white stand on this issue. I travel a fair bit. Part of it is for work. When I do, I often end up talking about my research to people that I meet. I often say that I study democracy promotion and receive a number of responses. One guy, a gentleman I talked to on a plane, told me a lot about how Jesus was really into democracy promotion, which I didn't know. But the most common response that I get is something like, democracy promotion, you mean like Iraq? This is what people think of when they think now, today, in 2014, of democracy promotion. They mean the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq and subsequent efforts to promote democracy there. Some of you today may have even had the same reaction when seeing the title of the talk and deciding to come today. Democracy promotion was, at the time, to be sure, in 2003, part of the rhetoric used to justify the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. But for those of you who were paying close attention at the time, the rhetoric about democracy promotion only popped up after weapons of mass destruction did not. Democracy promotion was used to help sell the invasion after the original justifications had failed to materialize. I could talk about this particular case, but perhaps obviously, at least to some of you, 2003 was not the beginning of democracy promotion by any stretch, nor is it a representative case of democracy promotion. So I'm actually not going to spend much time at all talking about Iraq in 2003 and since then. Rather, I'm going to talk about the fact that democracy promotion is something that has existed for a long time and has been a key component of the foreign policies of most developed democracies today. And it's also support for democracy and support for democracy in other countries is a principle that most countries in the world have signed on to, some of them insincerely, but they have signed on to through a variety of international agreements or in a few other forms. Democracy promotion only rarely involves military force, as occurred in the Iraq case that so many people are familiar with. The broader concept of democracy promotion can include the actual or threatened use of military force. but much more commonly includes rhetorical support for democracy as a legitimate form of government, direct democracy assistance, international benefits such as foreign aid that are conditioned on whether or not a country is democratic, and a number of other ways in which outside actors, foreigners, attempt to encourage democracy, often along with human rights, abroad. It's a bit hard to pinpoint the historical origins of democracy promotion. Some people reference Thomas Jefferson or even Napoleon. Of course, following the tragedies of World War I, Woodrow Wilson is credited with the famous phrase of working to make the world safe for democracy and popularizing the idea of liberal internationalism. The current era of democracy promotion is most commonly defined as beginning with the end of World War II and the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as post-war reconstruction efforts in Japan and Germany. Since that time, democracy promotion has been closely associated with US foreign policy, but what is somewhat less widely known is that most countries in the world have agreed to democratic principles and in many cases actively engage in democracy promotion beyond their borders. This is not just a US project, unlike what many people think. Most developed democracies, so most European states, North America, and a few other countries, include some kind of democracy promotion program explicitly within their foreign policy and spend money directly through international NGOs on a variety of forms of democracy assistance. You've heard of some of these intergovernmental organizations: the European Union, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Organization of American States, and a number of others now regularly engage in democracy promotion. So why should we care about this particular project, this particular idea of democracy promotion? From a very general perspective, I think this idea is interesting because in some ways it's bizarre that the internal politics of a sovereign state would be influenced by outsiders, particularly outsiders who are themselves in favor of the idea of popular sovereignty, right, who are advocating popular sovereignty in their work. Democracy, often on paper, is an entirely domestic affair. Yet in the developing countries in the world today, overwhelmingly, it is not a domestic affair in practice. So another question that we could ask in relation to this is why foreign actors bother to get involved in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. So why do they devote all of this effort? Some people estimate that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of in the tens of billions of dollars that are spent on democracy assistance each year, and that's only including direct democracy assistance. So this is not a small fraction of money. Arguments explaining this effort, explaining why democracy promotion is a good idea, come from really two camps that I'm going to talk a little bit about. The first justifies democracy promotion based on national interest, and the second justifies democracy promotion based on something like universal norms. The first argument, or those who argue in favor of promoting democracy abroad in the name of national interest, rely on a number of self-interested claims that a given democracy-promoting country will have better foreign relations or be in a more advantageous position globally if other countries in the world are also democratic. Democracies are said to be advantageous in a number of ways, that they're more reliable and transparent international partners, that democracies are more likely to respect human rights, less likely to go to war with one another, as is shown by the literature on democratic peace. That's probably the most common argument related to the national interest used to justify democracy promotion. And this argument is also most commonly associated with the foreign policy of the United States, but has been used by a number of governments to justify spending on democracy promotion efforts or to justify their actions that they're taking within other sovereign states. The second argument, having to do with universal norms, that is most commonly used to justify or explain democracy promotion efforts, is really based on the notion that if given a choice And all else held equal, most people in the world would rather live under democracy than under authoritarianism. This argument has something to do with international norms, and this notion is enshrined in numerous international agreements and international documents, most famously in Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So as Article 21 states, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. Everyone has the right of equal access to public service in his country. And the most quoted part is this third provision of Article 21. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So based on, in part on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and on other similar international commitments that have been signed by almost all states in the world, the notion that popular sovereignty can sometimes trump state sovereignty has gained quite a bit of traction. And powerful states and intergovernmental organizations have developed a variety of policies and procedures aimed at promoting democracy within sovereign states. So I want to push back a little bit further on the 2003 Iraq example that I hear from so many people now today when I'm talking about democracy promotion, because many of these people see democracy promotion as something that George W. Bush invented. And I want to make clear that democracy and democracy promotion has really been a mainstay of the U.S. presidency for most of the period since the end of World War II, and has been relatively consistent across Democratic and Republican administrations. So just relatively briefly, to go through some examples from each of these presidents. In a March 1961 speech, Kennedy said that democracy is the destiny of humanity, and it is the United States' obligation to serve as the single largest counter to the adversaries of freedom. Jimmy Carter in 1977 said that because we are free, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere. Ronald Reagan, in a widely cited address to the British Parliament that led to the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy, said that we must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings, and that it would be cultural condensation or worse to say that any people prefer dictatorship to democracy. Beginning with George H.W. Bush, the link between U.S. security and democracy became much more overt in these statements from U.S. presidents, with Bush arguing, George H.W. Bush arguing that the community of democratic nations is more robust now than ever, and it will gain strength as it grows. Importantly, he said that abandonment of the worldwide democratic revolution could be disastrous for American security. So again, making this argument related to the national interest of the United States and democracy promotion. Bill Clinton continued with this type of argument in 1993, stating that the United States' overriding purpose must be to expand and strengthen the world's community of market-based democracies. George W. Bush, of course, in 2005 said that it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world. And finally, addressing an audience in Cairo, Obama said that even the controversy over democracy promotion generated by the Iraq War, and here I quote, does not lessen my commitment to governments that reflect the will of the people, and that such governments are ultimately more stable, more successful, and more secure. So a lot of these arguments from these people are combining the universal norms and national interest arguments, right? But all of them are getting to some kind of agreement that democracy promotion should be a rightful part of U.S. foreign policy. Also, to be clear, the arguments in favor of democracy promotion are not at all that democracy is without any flaws. or is in any way a perfect form of government. A lot of people arguing against democracy promotion point out flaws with democracy in order to make their case. But those advocating for democracy, I don't think any of them are under the impression that democracy is a flawless form of government. But on average, if not more generally, they argue that democracy has some advantages over the alternatives, such as personalist dictatorship, monarchy, totalitarianism, and the like. I wanted to quote Yale's most famous theorist of democracy very briefly regarding the virtues of democracy over other regime types. Robert Dahl has said, or has written, democracy helps prevent rule by cruel and vicious autocrats, guarantees citizens a set of fundamental rights, ensures a broader range of personal freedoms, helps people protect their own fundamental interests, provides the maximum opportunity for self-determination, the freedom to live under laws of one's own choosing, provides the maximum opportunity for the exercise of moral responsibility, encourages human development, fosters a relatively high degree of political equality, promotes peace, as modern representative democracies do not fight one another, and generates prosperity. Some of these claims, of course, can be contested, and there are perhaps some exceptions to the rule that most people prefer democracy most of the time. I hear people bringing these up quite a bit when I go around and talk about my research. Bhutan's Happy Kingdom, where they measure not gross domestic product, but gross domestic happiness, is one example that I've heard. Singapore comes up all of the time as an example of authoritarian success. Although it's interesting here at Yale, when I'm teaching students from Singapore, I've had to explain a couple of times, more than once, that Singapore is in fact not considered a democracy, despite what they learned in school there. And China's economic success continues to emerge as the clearest threat to the universality of democracy, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the talk. Although it's important to note that the Chinese continue to make it clear that their example cannot be replicated in other countries, right? That they do not believe that the Chinese example is something that can be imitated. The Chinese government has also been claiming periodically for quite some time, at least as I read it, that they are moving gradually towards democracy in their own time and of their own form. So despite these counterexamples, cases like Bhutan, Singapore, and China, the most vigorous defenders of authoritarian regimes are usually the individuals who benefit disproportionately from them. So those defending autocracy, defending authoritarianism, tend to be those leaders who are able to stay in power for the remainder of their lives, the friends of kleptocrats, and the small circle of individuals who typically benefit from authoritarian governance. Rarely in human history have we seen examples of people amassing in the streets and risking their lives to demand a return to authoritarian rule. What we instead see is most often the opposite. Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen has written that the single most important event that occurred in the 20th century was the emergence of democracy as the preeminently acceptable form of governance. So, thus, when asking why democracy promotion exists and why countries and international organizations bother to expend so much time, effort, and money on foreign policy in this area, one runs into both of these arguments. First, that the devoting effort to promoting democracy abroad can be in a country's national interest, and that promoting democracy can also be justified on moral or normative grounds. Madeleine Albright is often quoted in relation to this idea. I think she's actually repeated this statement a number of times, so I don't even know the first time that she said it. But she says, in relation to democracy promotion, it is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do, right? So it's something that is in the U.S.'s interest and in other countries' interest, but also is morally the right thing to do. Of course, in addition to these two motives, there are also some actors, or some of the actors some of the time, potentially including the Bush administration in Iraq, who use the rhetoric of democracy promotion to cover, basically as window dressing for other aims, right? To cover for less publicly acceptable objectives. We see this quite often. Democracy promotion tends to be an allowable form of foreign intervention, and many other types of foreign intervention are not considered to be allowable forms of foreign intervention. I think it's also worth noting that on the ground, it's nearly impossible to separate the varying justifications for democracy promotion. Once policymakers reach agreement that democracy should be promoted in a given year or by a given population, money gets allocated towards democracy promotion, and the why of democracy promotion is no longer part of the conversation. This matters, to me at least, and I'll return to this point again, because promoting democracy in order to protect human rights or to decrease poverty and inequality might lead to different program choices and different strategies than if a country was engaging in democracy promotion with the goal of making countries more likely to follow through with their international commitments or to be less likely to go to war with a democracy promotion country. They don't necessarily prescribe the same set of democracy promotion activities, and this is something that's really left out of the debate. Okay. So just to expand a tiny bit on the question for the day, what have been the consequences of this widespread effort by many countries in the world to encourage democracy within other sovereign states? Given that democracy promotion democracy itself is a rich and varied concept, what is it exactly that all these foreigners are changing in the world? What sort of things move when they push? Do their efforts have unintended consequences? I think the unintended consequences of democracy promotion are pretty poorly understood. How might we know the answers to these questions, and why is this set of questions so vexing to answer? All of the questions I just listed are often answered by assumption, by people who are more or less ideological in their approach to this topic. For those of you who are interested in partisan politics in the United States, democracy promotion is this funny area where neoconservatives see eye to eye on a lot of areas with the liberal and internationalists, and they're not normally on the same part of the political spectrum. Among those people who support democracy promotion, if they often assume that good intentions are sufficient to have good effects. So if countries, international organizations, and international NGOs are genuinely trying to promote democracy, then they probably are. So the logic goes among some people that I've talked to. It's also sometimes measured in dollars spent, right? So if you've spent $10 million on democracy assistance, and you've probably had about that much positive effect, right? That's the way that the analysis is structured. Among people who are skeptical of democracy promotion, the answer to my question, does democracy promote democracy, is always no, regardless of really any evidence or examples to the contrary. Charges of imperialism are very common amongst this group of people, and the arguments tend to be quite normative. Neither side, even today, has much high-quality evidence at their disposal. And this is an area where a number of scholars, including the work that I have done, have tried to move this debate along. Okay. Before I get much further and really start talking about why I think this question is so difficult to answer, I wanted to spend a tiny bit of time talking about what it is that democracy promotion consists of, what democracy promoters actually do on the ground. There are lots of organizations engaged in democracy promotion. This is just like the organizations that I can think of off the top of my head while I was watching college basketball the other night, right? So this is just a small sampling of the organizations that are involved in democracy promotion. These organizations carry out hundreds, maybe even thousands of different programmatic activities each year intended to promote democracy. So there's things that they do on the ground. Part of democracy promotion also includes, at the very highest level, as I've already referenced, rhetorical commitments to democracy, and those rhetorical commitments by powerful states are combined with a foreign policy that sets a variety of costs and benefits conditioned on whether a country or government behaves appropriately. These rhetorical claims from powerful states and from international organizations include that they will support domestic movements in favor of democracy, or claims that democracy is the preferred form of government amidst trading partners, for foreign investors and the like. So a country that's not already democratic could reasonably start to expect that they would be better off if they democratized in terms of the international benefits that would flow into their country. We also see that when a country has done something to provoke international sanctions or other international isolation, the path back to normal bilateral relations with a number of countries typically involves the holding of new elections. So these are really sometimes incentives for countries to try to democratize on their own. And these high-level rhetorical commitments to democracy don't necessarily involve any direct intervention, any actual presence of foreigners setting foot inside the country. More narrowly and on the ground, democracy promotion and democracy assistance include lots and lots of more targeted activities. I'm going to talk about just a smattering of them, but my summary is not going to be comprehensive. One of the most well-known is international election observation. So some of you may recognize this woman observing an election in 1996, I believe, in Indonesia. International election observation is one of the most well-known types of democracy promotion, but it also includes funding for domestic election or citizen election observation. International and domestic election observers are supposed to detect election fraud, deter election fraud, and improve voter confidence in the electoral process. They also use their reports as a way to help international and domestic actors judge whether a given election was meeting expectations, whether that election was democratic, whether it was more fraudulent than anticipated. And these reports can have a number of effects that I have looked at in my research, and a number of other scholars have also looked at. Overall, international observers can help, do not always help, but can help increase incentives for governments to hold more democratic elections. There are many, many other activities. Direct election assistance and technical support are often provided by the United Nations Electoral Assistance Division and the UNDP. Other intergovernmental organizations will pay for things related to election assistance. These activities are explicitly nonpartisan and can involve direct collaboration with electoral management organizations. One of the things they might try to do, when I initially saw this picture, I thought that this was like a sign of people coming out and really showing their support for democracy, that this was this powerful image of the demand for democracy. When in fact, someone has later told me that this is really a picture of administrative failure, right? That poorly organized elections are the only ones that can ever get lines this long on election day. And one of the things that international actors do is try to help countries get the technical aspects right, to make sure that they have the right number of polling stations in the right number of places, that the ballot materials are designed properly, delivered in an efficient manner, and that all of the materials that they need are actually distributed. International actors are also often involved in, one of the things international actors do is that they buy ballot boxes. As I've traveled for a lot of elections, I've noticed that more and more, all of the ballot boxes look exactly like these, right? So there's some vendor out there that's winning all of the contracts with the UN, I think, to buy ballot boxes. But these also have a technology of securing the ballot boxes that's supposed to be hard to tamper with. They buy or train people how to use the famous indelible ink that's used to guard against multiple voting. I don't particularly think that indelible ink works very well, but it makes a good photo opportunity on election day. They also set up a lot of trainings for election officials, or help a country organize its own trainings for election officials. They can oversee or set up the updating of a voter registration list, or help countries develop a process for updating their own voter registration list. And at a bigger picture level, or this is one thing, they can help produce materials like this, where they basically just help a country come up with these little cartoons about how the electoral process is supposed to go on election day. So there's tons and tons and tons of these that have happened over the last, say, 25 years. Sometimes international actors are involved in helping rewrite election laws and providing expertise in constitutional changes that are intended to bring about more inclusive politics and this sort of thing. Voter education campaigns are very widespread. So if you're traveling around in a country during an election, you'll see signs like this. Many of these are paid for or encouraged by international actors engaged in democracy promotion. You'll also see these sorts of things. So here it's a little bit more clear. This is paid for Nigeria by NDI, USAID, and the British aid agency. It says no to ballot box snatching, do not sell your voter's card, no to rigging, your vote is your right, do not sell your vote, and vote wisely. So these sorts of voter education campaigns take place in most of the countries that I've worked in, right? These are very widespread, and they're often carried out by multiple organizations in the same country at the same time. There's activities related to parliamentary development, and this is a little bit harder to sum up, but these can include exchanges of parliamentarians and the staff of parliaments between countries. They often include the sort of improvements to the nuts and bolts of how legislative bodies are supposed to function. Sometimes they actually buy the desks in a parliament and this kind of thing, and they can train people about different voting procedures and record keeping and writing legislation and all this sort of stuff. Democracy promotion also very commonly includes a lot of political party training activities. So most programs offer assistance to all parties that want it. It's not that they go in and say, we're only going to train the parties that we like the best. They say, we're offering political party training to everyone. Some parties refuse to participate, but it's made available to everyone. Some organizations pay directly for public opinion polling in a country that doesn't already have it. They pay directly for this polling, make it available to the public on the assumption that more information about candidates' popularity might lead parties to make better decisions. And some organizations pay for, I believe this is in Cambodia, these are candidate debates, right? So this is a country that wouldn't necessarily have multi-party debates in advance of elections because of the work of one of the international NGOs that's active in Cambodia. They have candidate debates all over the country. All right. Sometimes they go as far as trying to adopt or trying to encourage parties to adopt specific strategies. So in a lot of new democracies or countries that are new to holding elections, there'll be 172 political parties. One incumbent political party and 171 opposition political parties. And so one of the things democracy promoters will try to do is they will try to get them to coordinate, right? To form some sort of coalition in order to have a better chance of winning some sort of meaningful representation at the international level. All right. Democracy promotion occasionally bleeds into other issue areas. I was trying to think of some good examples. Many of these examples are closely tied to greater protection of human rights. Training police and the military in specific forms of policing and crowd control during political events is one example. So you wouldn't think that police training is necessarily democracy promotion, but I have seen this happen in a couple of places where they're trying to get the police to better engage with what can be somewhat exciting political events and keep the calm and keep people from hurting one another. The final category that I don't know that much about because it's very ambiguous to me is that a lot of money goes to promoting what's called civil society, right? So this is sort of this catch-all category that they spend a lot of money on. I don't really know what it is in some countries, but if you have an NGO, you can get money that's devoted to civil society promotion. All right, so now I'm going to get to the part of the talk that I'm actually most excited about. So those of you that already know about democracy promotion, everything was probably just a review. I'm going to raise a few issues related to why I think it is so difficult for us to know, to answer this question about whether democracy promotion actually promotes democracy. This question is difficult to answer for reasons related to unintended consequences of democracy promotion, perhaps a contested understanding of causality, and a lack of consensus about what it means for democratization to have occurred. So I'm going to illustrate this basic point about why this question is so difficult to answer with 4 points. First of all, it is unambiguously the case, at least in my opinion, that international support for democratization and the existence of all of these benefits at the international level that are tied to countries becoming more democratic is partly responsible for the massive proliferation of countries that hold periodic national elections, and that also adopt a number of other formal institutions associated with democracy. So let me be clear. This does not mean that all election-holding countries in the world are democratic. In fact, I think this is one of the most tired phrases in the field of democracy promotion, and one that regularly makes me want to tear my hair out, is when people say that democracy is more than elections. Politicians love to use this phrase as an applause line. I just noticed today that when Barack Obama used this line in his Cairo speech, he said, "Elections alone do not make true democracy." One audience member was moved to interrupt him and shout, "Barack Obama, we love you," which made me crazy, right? Because no one, as far as I have ever been able to uncover, has ever said that all a country needs to do to become a democracy is to hold an election, maybe a fraudulent election, right? No one makes this argument. No one has ever made this argument that I can find. And so this is why I find it frustrating when academic articles conclude with this grand statement that elections are not all there is to democracy, or that democracy is more than elections. But it's now a platitude that politicians really like to reference. But even given my frustration about this one small point, it is now true that of sovereign states with a population over 500,000, which is a common threshold that we use in international relations, elections and a variety of other democratic institutions are nearly universal. And we are only beginning to understand the consequences of this trend. So I've made this very rough animation of the global spread of elections on a world map. And before I show it, I want to just warn you just a little bit, because all of it is imposed on a 2013 map. So it's the quickest way I could do it a couple of days ago was to use a map that the borders don't change over time. So you have to excuse that. Countries that don't exist yet are shown in yellow, right? They become countries by 2013. And from what I'm about to show you, you can see the year will be at the top. Countries that are colored in very light gray are countries that have held elections in the prior 5 years. Countries that are black or very dark colored have never held a national election or have not held an election in the previous 10 years. So I can see if I can make this go. So you can see the year at the top. And then you watch the trend over time. There's a lot of countries that go dark for a while, and then the trend reverses itself. So as you'll eventually see while you're watching this, the only countries that, as of 2012, when these data stop, that had not held national elections in the previous 10 years, which is a pretty long interval to expect elections to happen, are China, Eritrea, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and the United Arab Emirates. So if you weren't counting, that's 6. 6 countries in the world did not hold national level elections in the period from 2003 to 2012. I think that just by itself is a kind of remarkable trend, that this is something that has almost completely disappeared, right? So we watched this, I don't know why I have 2002 at the end there, something got out of order. But by the end of this, there's only 6 countries in the world that had not held national elections And 5 of those don't hold any national elections through this entire time period. So, why is this trend not necessarily good news for the spread of democratization? So, pretty obviously, some of these elections are not exercises in democracy. For those of you who are noticed, I know there's a lot of errors in this map, and if any graduate students in the room would like to help me make it better, I would love to work with you on a little bit of mapping. It's not my specialty. Many of these elections are not democratic at all. So North Korea holds elections periodically. No one is under the impression that they're democratic. Right? It's 100% turnout, 100% of vote. It's a little bit less, but they actually explain in some of their state-run press releases how they go and get the infirm to vote and how they get elderly people to vote from hospitals and whatnot. So some of the elections, as many of you know, are used as tools of authoritarian control. Elections not just in North Korea, but also countries like Belarus or Turkmenistan. If we put those elections aside and instead focus on those that do allow some real multi-party competition, there are still some very interesting dynamics that make it difficult to judge the overall effects of this trend in which elections have spread throughout the entire world. Within elections, the most obvious dynamic that I think is interesting is that all of this intense attention to election day, both in getting the technical aspects right, so some of the things that I showed you pictures of, making sure you have ballot boxes with the right secure, tamper-proof technology, but also in sending lots of domestic and international observers, has made it significantly more difficult to manipulate an election on election day and get away with it. So some leaders manipulate elections obviously on purpose. Activities like ballot box stuffing and overt vote buying, right? Things that used to happen pretty obviously on election day. Coercive control of polling stations by police or military, other types of election day shenanigans are now very difficult to get away with, right? So you might commit them, but you're almost certain to be caught. What I think this has resulted in is a more widespread recognition that there are many ways to manipulate elections or to bias elections in favor of one party. And greater attention to election day has led some governments to engage in what I have referred to with co-authors as strategic manipulation. So this is engaging in precisely those types of election manipulation that are less likely to get caught. Does this result in better elections? The spread of strategic manipulation, does this make elections better? I don't know. I'm very frustrated by the question. It is clear that some of the techniques are more benign than election day fraud, right? So if a government engages in, say, more negative campaigning or gerrymandering or something like this, that's probably more benign than election day ballot box stuffing or something like this. But other forms of strategic manipulation, like murder, disappearance, or intimidation of opposition political candidates well before election day in a subtle manner that is never caught, are not so benign and maybe much greater threats to democracy than ballot box stuffing ever was, right? It's very difficult to judge this. The claim that a focus on clean elections may increase incentives for less visible forms of election manipulation is an extraordinarily difficult claim to evaluate. If regimes are truly good at manipulating elections strategically, there will be little evidence that we can ever uncover of this occurring, and scholars will have a hard time distinguishing between elections that were clean and elections that were manipulated. And this makes it very difficult to judge, as my colleague Nikolai Marinov has put it, whether the global spread of elections is in fact good for democracy. What is clear to me is that the simple act of holding national elections can itself be unpredictable. It is a little bit more risky for incumbents, even those autocrats that are pretty good at manipulating elections in their favor. It actually might be risky to them as well, and maybe harder for autocrats to stage manage these electoral processes than it may seem at first blush. Just the simple fact of holding elections, even the very, very rigged elections that are making an appearance on this figure, may introduce much greater uncertainty to a leader's ability to stay in power than would exist if they didn't hold elections at all. So just that, I think, is good news for democracy, but it's a little bit tricky. The second reason why it's difficult to judge whether democracy promotion actually promotes democracy really builds on the first. So if there is international pressure, and I'm going to turn this off here, in favor, or I'll put it this way, if there is international pressure in favor of democracy, or all of these democracy contingent benefits that I talked about earlier, this should create very strong incentives for countries to look and act like democracies, even if they have no intention to truly democratize. Refusing to play the game of adopting formal electoral processes and democratic political institution in the past 25 years or so would put a country squarely in the camp of a group of pariah states, really. These international benefits tied to democracy may push some countries towards further democratization. It might be the nudge that they need. But it's also relatively clear that the same incentives motivate a subset of leaders to fake it. In other words, they seek to look and act like a democracy in order to receive international benefits, or at least create some plausible deniability and evade internationally imposed costs. But these leaders are never really willing to step down if they were to lose in elections, right? So they're playing the game, but they're unwilling to abide by the rules if the rules don't end up favoring them. So democracy promotion may be contributing to an increase in the number of true democracies in the world. This is possible. But it may also simultaneously be contributing to the number, to an increase in the number of pseudo-democracies, of countries that adopt democratic institutions, but may not be democratizing in any meaningful sense. And this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, I think is fascinating. The third reason why it's difficult to answer questions about the efficacy of democracy promotion is that the formal institutions of democracy are sometimes adopted in the hope that they will solve a whole bunch of other social and economic problems. As in the Robert Dahl quote that I outlined earlier, democracy is associated with a long list of positive side effects that have been uncovered in relation to countries that are already democratic. Basically, these lists of positive effects of democracy were developed based on Western Europe and North America. It is possible that societies that democratized 50 or 100 years ago, wherever you want to pin it, are fundamentally different from those countries in the world that have not yet democratized. And when democratic political institutions are extended to countries in these different circumstances, it's not clear that the introduction of democratic political institutions will result in the same positive outcomes. So democracy as a means to other ends may fail, even if the end of democracy is achieved. And this failure of democracy to achieve all of these other goals may be used to pronounce democracy promotion a failure. I realize this is a little bit of a complicated point. So another way to put some examples to it, even if democracy promoters successfully help democratize many countries in the near future, democratic institutions may not cause these countries to become less war-prone, right? This might not be the case that the democratic peace continues to hold, might not cause these countries to become better trading partners, might not cause these countries to better respect rule of law and human rights, become better climates for investment, decrease poverty and inequality, or choose better leaders, or there's a whole bunch of other things that we could talk about. Part of the problem is that we don't know how long democratization should take. If a country has a lot of initial challenges to overcome when democratizing, many of today's wealthy democracies, democratization took place over decades and generations. How long should democratization take in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo? Has a lot of challenges to overcome before fully functioning democracy will be in place. In Azerbaijan and Cambodia, countries that have very different challenges. So this lesson, that democratic institutions are not a silver bullet for all of a society's problems, is something that we continue to learn again and again. It's like a lesson that people have a hard time accepting in the long term. And it really gets us back to this question of why democracy was being promoted in the first place. If democracy is an end in and of itself, then the side effects of democracy don't matter. If democracy is promoted because of other strategic aims related to the national interest type argument that I outlined earlier, then these questions actually matter a lot and may need to be better integrated on the ground with how democracy promotion programs are carried out. The final reason that I'll just reference very briefly, because it's kind of wonky, but it's very near and dear to social scientists, is just this notion of causal inference. So, as I've already mentioned, it's absolutely clear that there are more democracies today than there have ever been before. And that this massive increase in the percent of the world's population living under democracy did happen concurrently with a massive increase in democracy promotion effort. Partly related to the three other reasons I've just cited, but also due to a number of other factors. We cannot say with any confidence, or at least I cannot say with any confidence, that this massive increase in the number of democracies in the world was caused by democracy promotion. Untangling this knot of causality is much more challenging than showing that these things go together, and it's something that I and others will continue to spend a lot of time on. There are a number of exciting studies that are really on the cutting edge of research on this topic that begin to do exactly this. And they show that sometimes democracy promotion programs work as intended, and sometimes they do not, right? We're only beginning to evaluate some of these questions. The next challenge is to tie these very specific studies to some more general theory of democracy promotion that considers the other 3 points I've just raised. So really to conclude the talk, I'm going to engage in a tiny bit of speculation. I normally avoid talking about my own predictions for the future, but I've been told that that's not very fun. And so I'm going to just spend a tiny bit of time talking about the future of democracy promotion. So overall, it's pretty, mildly confident that democracy promotion has, at least on the margins, contributed to democratization in some places, if not in many places. Countries that are not already democratic can be pushed on the path toward democratization by international actions, sometimes through direct intervention, sometimes through the demonstration of what works, and sometimes through these international incentives for democratization. Some democratization today may be insincere or hollow, and I think this is a major area of research that more needs to be done on. It is remarkable to me today that most countries in the world are already holding periodic national elections. Most of those countries now allow multi-party competition, even if it is maybe not a totally level playing field. And another thing that we have seen is that there's few places left in the world where scholars or pundits continue to argue that a certain type of people is not fit for democracy, as Amartya Sen has discussed at length. It's also clear to me that the easy cases of democratization have already happened. The countries left in the world that haven't yet democratized face some pretty serious challenges. So this makes it quite difficult to speculate on the future of democracy promotion. I think it's fair to say that lessening international pressure for democracy, as I think has already happened a bit in the past 8 years, or perhaps even dating back to this 2003 Iraq case, should mean that fewer leaders expose themselves to the risks associated with adopting formal democratic institutions. If international support for democracy declines dramatically, we should see a reversal of many of the trends that I've talked about today, and there might even already be a little bit of evidence of this. So this flat between 2003 and 2013, the same Freedom House data that I showed before, showed, in fact, a slight decline in the percentage of democracies in the world, or the percentage of free countries in the world. One of the biggest factors that will contribute to the future of democracy promotion and could contribute to a dramatic decrease in international support for democracy is the rise of China as an alternative source of foreign support for many countries in the world. So it's not clear to me how this will play out, but it is already apparent that China's influence in Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere has made a number of countries less dependent on Western support and therefore less likely to be influenced by Western international pressure in favor of democracy. A counter trend was made clear with the beginning of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring also surprised many of the more pessimistic pundits, some of whom had decided that democracy is somehow undesired by Arab people or that it's fundamentally incompatible with the type of Islam that exists in Arab countries. The apparent wellspring of demand for democracy in the Arab world is notable. Other than China, this was until the Arab Spring really the last part of the world where you would still hear people genuinely arguing that certain populations weren't cut out for democracy, that they couldn't handle it or something like that, which I think is clear that that's not the case. For the U.S. and other Western countries, the Arab Spring yet again brings up tensions between democracy promotion and other strategic goals in foreign policy, like supporting allies and encouraging stability. Democracy promotion has never and will never trump all other strategic aims in foreign policy. If anything, it's a third or fourth or fifth tier goal of foreign policy, maybe even further down the list. This leads to charges of hypocrisy in foreign policy and often causes a tension in foreign policy and decision-making between what are basically long and short-term goals related to democracy promotion. So judging tomorrow whether the U.S. will be better off with a loyal dictator in power in an allied country or a functioning democracy, even if that democracy sometimes elects leaders that are not necessarily closely aligned with U.S. interests, is a very difficult question to answer. I tend to think that support for autocrats and an unwillingness to put up with democratically elected leaders who are not necessarily allies is short-sighted, but many people disagree with me on that point. With that, I'm going to stop. I think I've gone a bit over time, and I will open it up for questions.
Great, I'd love to have some questions from the audience. Susan, why don't you repeat the question for the
Okay,
video?
yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your talk. My question relates to a comment that you made towards the end, that whether a pseudo-democracy, whether it's actually, that the jury is still out as to whether pseudo-democracies are helpful in the way that they push a country more toward total democracy or whether it's this kind of window dressing.
Mm-hmm.
My question is it possible that it might actually be worse than that, i.e. that a pseudo-democracy might actually harm a country's prospects toward becoming a full democracy? The reason I ask is a lot of aid from the U.S. and many other nations is key to a country's status as a democracy. For that reason, the State Department did not declare that Egypt is no longer a democracy, and even declared for many years that Nicaragua is no longer a democracy. Venezuela, Russia, a couple other good pseudo-democracies. So I'm just kind of curious, is there any literature or thinking or stats out there showing whether it might actually cause outright harm?
Repeating the question, yes, that's briefly. The question is really whether pseudo-democracy and the increase in pseudo-democracy throughout the world might in the end be worse for democracy than if those countries continued as autocracies. Could it lead people to view democracy differently? I think that there's some people who have written on this. The people who have the worst opinions of democracy are people who live in democracies, which is an interesting comparative public opinion finding. That's not universally true, but pretty much on average, that's what we see. The way that I've put your question before is whether pseudo-democracy is, I'm I'm going to get in trouble using this example with some of the people in the room here, but whether you're basically making uber autocrats, right, who are sort of akin to these antibiotic-resistant bacteria, right, that they get so good at playing this international game that there's nothing that can ever happen to take them out of power. It's very hard to separate that from countries that are moving towards democracy and are on the cusp of democratizing. There is some evidence to suggest that just holding elections, even bad elections, in countries that held elections under autocracy are more likely to successfully democratize. So we do know some things like that, but to say that Hugo Chavez and had no negative effect on democracy in Venezuela, it's a really hard question to answer because we never get to observe the counterfactual, right? We never get to see what's happening. But so I think it's an open question. Some of these leaders are probably becoming much more entrenched in power and much better at playing this game, evading international sanction. Yes?
I don't see you mentioning anything about the economic dimensions behind the issue of democracy here. In other words, what we see is the failure of the communist socialist system, and later on the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, etc., etc. If this had any role in the promotion of democracy, knowing that just these so-called third world countries will have nowhere to turn here other than the West, especially the United States.
So, this talk is short for a general audience, so it's hard to sum up everything that I know about democracy promotion this time. You're right, I didn't talk about that. The way that I think about it is that during the Cold War period especially, there were a number of countries, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. I didn't talk about, I have to do this for the recording since you don't have a microphone, that the economic dimensions were left out of my talk, and that part of the story is about a failure of communism rather than a success of democracy. And some of these trends are related to that. I think that's absolutely the case. During the Cold War period, what I talk about in a lot of my research is that this is a time in which countries did face multiple options. And one of the reasons why democracy promotion took off so strongly beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, is because even Western democracies like the US were no longer propping up anti-communist dictators, right? So that this game was taken off. The value that countries could take advantage of for being simply anti-communist was taken off the table. And so countries had to do something else in order to gain those international benefits. So that's something I talk quite a bit about in my book. But it's also really apparent in the trends over time. So most of anything you can look at it's sort of gradually increasing from 1945 to 1989, and then there's a huge step function change in what's going on. So that's a good point. It's just something I didn't cover.
So, thank you for all this.
Yeah.
Do we know what sort of on like the global level what the distribution of funds looks like to different types of democracy promotion efforts? Because it seems to me that the lion's share goes to international election observation, or at least a large share, and that's actually I would say the least effective
Mm-hmm.
tool. But I don't know if it's even possible to know on a global scale what's happening.
So the question is whether there's any global level data on the distribution of funds to different types of programmatic activities in the democracy promotion field. I believe that the Aid Data Project is working on this, but it's hard because you have to trust that the aid organizations appropriately categorize things in their project codes, and they like to double count things. So international election observation is probably counted as support for women's representation or something like that, right? Because they think it has all of these positive side effects. So I've never seen anything that I believe on that. Election observation, people pay attention on election day, so I think to the extent that you care about these reputational effects at the international level, it may be the most motivating to autocratic leaders to try to move in the right direction. But in terms of affecting people directly, there's a ton of other programs that are probably more effective at that. And so, but we have very little ability to even make those types of judgments given the evidence that we have. So.
more questions. There was a hand right there, and then we'll take the.
I'm sorry, I'm Harry?
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on anti-terrorism as a replacement for anti-communism as a kind of cover. And up until the end of the Cold War, we supported all sorts of sleazy countries who got an exemption because they were anti-communist. And to some extent, anti-terrorism has somewhat replaced that. I wonder if you could comment on that in the context of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, so I think the question is, thank you, that anti-terrorism, the question is anti-terrorism a replacement for anti-communism, that the U.S. and other Western governments are now willing to funnel a lot of money to undesirable anti-terrorist countries or countries that cooperate on anti-terrorist activities, in the same way that we funnel a lot of money to undesirable dictators during the Cold War simply because they were anti-communist. I think probably, but I think that we haven't had quite enough time for me to judge it. I've seen a couple of PhD students working on questions related to this. And then I know you're the Bangladesh expert, but I did go there recently. The organization that we were hoping to work with is a well-respected human rights group there. And they made the mistake of counting the number of dead protesters that were potentially killed by government forces. They put a number on the protesters, and within not very great amount of time, the government disappeared many of the people involved in this organization, or two main people. They've now reappeared, but it's a pretty difficult thing. So the question is, why is Bangladesh, this very aid-dependent country, all of a sudden willing to start disappearing human rights activists, right? I think it's because the dead protesters that they counted happened to be more fundamentalist Muslims, right? And that they thought they could get away with it having something to do with their cooperation on anti-terror policy. So you see these little examples popping up all over the place. But do we have any systematic evidence of this yet? I don't personally. I think some people are researching this, and I'd like to see more of it. My intuition would be that yes, it's almost exactly like anti-communism, although it's a little bit less clear which governments count as the good guys and which governments count as the bad guys.
Your thoughts on the influence of international sanctions on pseudo-democracies?
So my thoughts on the influence of international sanctions on pseudo-democracies. The political science international relations literature on international sanctions is quite pessimistic on anyone, right? There's not a lot of evidence that suggests that they're particularly effective most of the time. But that said, I tend to think that some governments are responsive to being named and shamed. There's some governments that know that they're really important and can get away with anything. So I think Mubarak's Egypt fell into that category, right? I think he sort of knew that he could get away with quite a bit and took advantage of it. What wouldn't have been super influenced by the threat of sanctions. And I think there's other countries that seem to be quite influenced by sanctions, right? That they can actually lose most of their budget if they end up being sanctioned. And so you actually never see them step over the line too far. These are the countries that are easiest to get to move towards democracy. So there's a lot of selection problems in answering your question, but I think it's not implausible that governments that would otherwise be pretty autocratic are influenced by some of these incentives for them to be more democratic. All done? Okay.
So before you all get up, I want to do three things. First, I want to thank Susan for a splendid talk. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. Secondly, I want to invite you to our reception where Susan will come and you can ask her some more questions. It's just next door here in the common room. And third, I want to invite you to return here on April 16th to hear Gary Tomlinson from the Department of Music in the Humanities Center about the history of music here on Earth. See you then, or see you at the reception.